Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
Real Agriculture presents Frontlines, geopolitics affecting agriculture with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Real Agriculture's Shaun Haney. Shaun Haney here with RealAgriculture.com. It's time for another episode of Frontlines, and I'm joined, of course, as always, by Jacob Shapiro with Cognitive Investments. Jacob, great to chat with you.
Shaun, we're going to struggle for things to talk about. The world is such a boring place.
Yeah, it's opposite day here at the Frontlines podcast. Okay, there's a lot of stuff to chat about, but I think today we're going to focus in on what's exactly going on in the Middle East. As for those of us that follow it from afar, aren't experts in the field, it feels like it's becoming a heightened situation of complexity. And I was with some friends on the weekend, and everybody just sort of did the woof, sort of the gravity of the situation as we heard what Iran had launched drones on Israel. I guess what started this back and forth? Did Israel strike on some Iranian targets?
Oh gosh, what started this? Well, first of all, let me give you a little anecdote. So it was my wife and I's fifth wedding anniversary on Saturday, and my phone started blowing up about 2 hours before we were supposed to go to dinner, and because Iran, whatever else. And she looked at me and she said, do we have to cancel? Do we need to move the date? And I said, absolutely not. Let me just tweet, this is a big nothing burger, and let's go enjoy our dinner and go from there. So I was not as worried maybe necessarily as everybody else. That is not to say that there aren't important things happening here. That isn't to say that there isn't an escalatory scenario that concerns me. But I think the first thing we need to keep in mind, Iran told everyone and their mother for over 72 hours, hey, we're going to launch some rockets. We're going to launch some drones. Hey, we're doing this thing. We don't want it to escalate, but we're going to launch some things. So I'll be worried when they do the launch without telling everybody ahead of time, not when they're doing the launch that is very, very clearly, to your point, a response to something Israel did around April 1st. It's funny, when you ask, when did this start? I mean, we could go back to the ancient Persian and Israelite empires if you want, but the answer to your...
That is not what I know.
I know, and we don't have time, but I mean, I can do that too. But no, you're exactly right. Israel assassinated an Iranian general who was in Syria at an Iranian consulate in Syria, which that's like striking Iranian territory. I think it's a little rich. The United States is now telling Israel that it needs to not do that sort of thing anymore, because the U.S. did that to Soleimani in a certain sense under the Trump administration, but we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. But yes, Israel assassinated an Iranian general at an Iranian consulate inside of Syria, and Iran felt like it needed to respond. And by the way, that Israeli strike, in sharp contrast to what the Iranians just did, Israel didn't tell anybody about it. And the United States has expressed to Israel since then, hey, you can't do that because it's going to have impacts on our own, U.S. troop forces in Iraq and in Jordan and all these other places. So give us a heads up next time. We thought we're supposed to be allies sharing information. So Iran's missiles and drones, I think, were a tit-for-tat response to that assassination of that Iranian general. Now, I do think there are interesting things that are like, why did Iran choose to do what it did? What did Iran learn? Was this a success for Iran? We can get into that too, because I think that there is a lot to get into there, but that's at least the cause of what happened.
So I do want to get into the why. I've seen a few members of our audience, sort of just tweeting about, or Xing, I guess we should say, about the matter, and everybody wondering, what's Iran's strategy here? Why did they notify everybody for the 72 hours? Was it to say, hey, we're going to do this, please shoot them down, which was actually the end result by Israel and some of the allies?
Well, Iran doesn't want escalation. Look at Iranian oil production over the last couple of years. They've finally gotten above 3 million barrels per day. They're finally putting some hard currency in their coffers. The economy is finally not a disaster. It's a little bit better than a disaster. So there's a lot of reasons why Iran doesn't want an escalatory scenario. Go back, I think the last time we were on front lines was right when that Iranian proxy had killed some U.S. soldiers in Iraq. And remember, Iran basically called the proxy and said, no, don't do that. It's okay to for the Houthis to shoot off some missiles in the Red Sea, but we don't want you killing U.S. soldiers. That takes us down a dark path that we don't want to go to. So yeah, I think they were warning because they didn't want the escalatory situation. But I also think they were able to achieve some aims, even though they warned everybody. One of the things I've been struck by is both in Israeli and Western media, there's a level of smugness about, Israel's missile defense, it worked. It was able to defeat the Iranians. This was a terrible, Iran has no capability and things like that. I don't see it that way at all. Iran just showed that it can basically shut down the Israeli economy when it threatens to bomb it. It showed, I think, that it has the potential to oversaturate Israel's missile defense capabilities. So imagine if they fired doubled the number of drones and rockets and missiles that they fired. Imagine that they didn't tell the United States in advance. So the United States couldn't pre-position some of its anti-missile capabilities, which it did in this particular case to help the Israelis shoot them down. Suddenly Iran is telling you, hey, if you mess with us, we can mess with you. You're not just going to get to assassinate our generals and we're not going to do sort of anything else. I think the other interesting part of this is that Iran also just showed that if it telegraphs a maneuver like this, it can get the U.S. Navy, like I said, to pre-position assets. It can get the eye of the United States military to focus squarely on the Middle East. And who are Iran's biggest partners right now? Well, Russia is the biggest one. Iran is exporting a lot of drones and rockets and that to the Russian economy. China is a little bit more of a fair weather friend, but they sell a lot of that oil to China. And if you're in a multipolar world, China and Iran have some things in common. It's wonderful for Iran to know that it can flip a switch and the United States is going to get focused on the Middle East. What can Russia do with information like that? What can China do with information like that? If you know that, hey, we can attract the attention of this power that is our rival, we could do something over here while you guys go and do something else. I think that's also a really important thing for Iran to learn. So I think they were showing off capabilities. I think they were testing the resolve of Israel's allies. And I think that they were trying to do all that without escalating. And I think they achieved that. The last thing I know I've gone on for a little bit of a longer spiel here, but I'll just say this is also keeping with Iran's strategy since October 7th. Just look at what the Houthis have done in the Red Sea. We've talked about this before too. Iran is showing you we have proxies. We can make things more difficult for you. We can make things more costly for you. You can't just fire a couple of missiles at us and our proxies and us are going to go away. No, we're going to push back. We're going to fight back. Get ready for a bigger fight if you want to do these things with us. So that, I think, is what Iran was pushing. And I think in that sense, they can claim some successes in a way that the West maybe doesn't want it to.
Israel has said that they intend to retaliate against Iran for those drone attacks. I read in a couple different publications. The UK's David Cameron, one of the people carrying that message. Do we expect them to do that, or are they just going to talk about it to establish the threat that it's possible?
I'd be shocked if they didn't respond in some meaningful way, but the question is whether they're going to respond in an escalatory way. If they decide to hit a bunch of Iranian proxies in Syria or go after Hezbollah or something like that, that's not an escalation. The escalation would be if they go and hit sort of Iranian military installations in Iranian territory. And this is why I'm much more concerned about what Israel is going to do next than I was with Iran's telegraphed attack. And the reason is because it seems to me that just about every actor involved in this conflict has an incentive to de-escalate, except Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister of Israel. It seems to me that for him, the longer the war goes on, the longer he has to avoid corruption charges, the longer he has to avoid investigations into the security failure in October in Israel, the longer he gets to cling to power in Israel. So he's the one that bothers me because he's the one that I can't quite predict. You're also seeing at the top levels of the Israeli government serious disagreement between Netanyahu, between his defense minister, between Benny Gantz, who's the opposition figure who came into the coalition to prosecute the war. He's now publicly, and privately apparently disagreeing with Netanyahu, and there's differences about what the military strategy should be. Is he going to leave the coalition so that he can bring the government down and challenge him? All of these things make Israel's next move worry me a little bit more than what Iran has just done. My bet, I think the base case is still yes, they'll respond, but they'll go after proxies. They will do something that is not going to cause Iran to then escalate further. But I'm less sure of that than I was sure that I didn't think Iran's attack on Israel was going to be that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things.
Is it fair to say that President Biden lacks influence on the actions of Prime Minister Netanyahu?
That's a difficult question to answer. I mean, President Biden and the United States in general has a lot of influence. The fact that Iran felt the need to tell the United States what it was going to do ahead of time,
Right.
that's a form of influence right there. Like that's even, Iran is telling the great Satan what it's going to do. Like that's a remarkable sign of influence from two countries that really don't deal with each other that much. And I do think that Biden has some influence over Benjamin Netanyahu and has been able to constrain some of his actions. But Biden's also in a weak position right now. He's going into election season, and Netanyahu had a very good relationship with Trump. So maybe if you're Netanyahu, you're just trying to, delay until maybe Trump is going to win again, and then you get somebody in the White House who's willing to deal with you a little bit more. So, I mean, Israel is going to do what it's going to do no matter what the United States says, and Netanyahu is going to do whatever he thinks he needs to do no matter what the United States says. But yes, when Biden, and he reportedly, called Netanyahu after Israel shot down all the rockets and stuff, and at least the reporting was he told Netanyahu some version of, okay, you got to win, take the win, stop there. We are not going to help you if you escalate the situation. So I at least think that Biden has gotten the message through, like, okay, like you can do a tit for tat response, but if you bomb Iranian territory and you're expecting us to deploy the aircraft carriers to help you, you are sorely mistaken. We're not going to do that. So in that sense, like, yes, that's influence because now Netanyahu has to sort of, well, are they bluffing? Would they actually help me if we got into that kind of conflict? Or is it really worth it to risk that? Maybe I'll just do the tit for tat thing and I've gotten what I wanted out of everything else, which is everybody's talking about Iran and not about the plight of the Palestinians anymore on the PR front.
Yeah. President Biden had also said to Iran, no. I think it was like something like that in terms of the retaliation that went disregarded as well to some extent, I guess. So Israel has said that they will not end the fighting until Hamas is annihilated. Hamas has said they will not release the hostages without a truce that includes a clear path to end the war. Are either of the, like, what's the probability on either of those having getting across the finish line?
I don't think the annihilation of Hamas is a realistic goal. It reminds me of the United States war on terror. You can't defeat terror. You could kill every single senior member of Hamas, and sort of the ideological Muslim Brotherhood component of it, the framework would still be there. So you would just get new leaders calling themselves Hamas or something else with the same ideology in that group. So I don't know how you annihilate Hamas. And as for Hamas, anything that Hamas says, if you're an Israeli negotiator, like how are you supposed to take that after what they did on October 7th? It's really hard to sort of build any trust there. And these Gulf countries, especially Qatar, have been trying. They've been trying to get the two sides to talk to each other, trying to get some form of ceasefire on the table, and it's just not working. Remember, Hamas is also not a monolith. It seems clear in the aftermath of October of last year that some factions of Hamas were surprised at what happened and are not necessarily happy with what happened because of the death and destruction that it's brought on Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. There are others, the ones who were the masterminds behind the attack, who this is what they wanted. They want martyrdom. They want to be a rallying cry. They want the Muslim world to be supporting them in this meaningful way. So no, I think the depressing answer to your question is I don't see that we're anywhere close to a ceasefire, and it seems clear that Israel is going to go into Rafah and is going to, eviscerate every single part of the Gaza Strip, and then it's going to try to declare victory in some way, and it's going to be a Pyrrhic one. Like it's not actually going to be able to control the Gaza Strip meaningfully. And I'm shocked a little bit at how Israel can get in this position. I mean, we've seen how the IDF is not equipped for these kind of police actions or long-term occupations. We saw it in Lebanon in the early 1980s. We've seen it in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip for literally decades, and they think this is going to end any different just because they killed some more militants and sacrificed more of their soldiers. Like, I don't exactly know what the strategic thought is. It doesn't look like strategy to me.
In the Ukraine-Russia war, a lot of focus has been on the Ukraine constraints or lack of resources and the need for support from the West. In the context of what's going on with Israel, where do they sit from a resource standpoint to be able to push through on this conflict that could last quite some time?
I thought Zelensky made a very savvy speech after the events of the weekend, in which he basically said, "Congratulations to the West for disrupting this Iranian attack. We Ukrainians know what it's like to be attacked by Iranian drones and missiles because they're shipping, Iran is shipping those drones and missiles to Russia, and Russia's using them against us. And by the way, why don't we have missile defense too? And why can't the West and NATO defend Ukraine the way that it just defended Israel? Israel's not a NATO ally. There's no defense security commitments and things like that. And yet, like there was missile defense for Israel against an attacking country like Iran. Why should there not be that similar level of support for Ukraine? I intend to talk to our Western partners about how we can get missile defense in Ukraine. I thought that was a very, very savvy, like on point, like trying to get the conversation back to Ukraine in general. Ukraine's shortages for ammunition are well known. European countries like the Czech Republic are trying to help them fix it. But right now, Russia has more materiel than Ukraine does. And in an attritional war, things are sort of in Russia's favor, certainly in the East. And I think the scenario that we're getting with Ukraine right now, I'm less worried than I was maybe a month ago about a Russian breakthrough of Ukraine's defenses. But it looks like parts of Eastern Ukraine are just going to be parts of Russia, and parts of Western Ukraine are going to become part of some kind of Euro-led alliance. And we're going to have to. Europe is going to have to commit seriously to defending those parts of Western Ukraine, because Putin's not going to be happy with that. He's going to want to continue to push. And in that sense, like what happened in Israel is a really interesting test case for what that looks like in the context of Europe's fight against Russia in the long term.
Where are we at from your perspective when it comes to support from the U.S. for Israel, whether that's financially or other supplies, in contrast to the Speaker Johnson's challenges of getting support for Ukraine?
I'm not sure why the Republicans, I think this is a losing hand for the Republicans. I'm not sure why the speaker is sort of holding things up from this point of view. He's just giving Biden sort of a foreign policy win from that point of view. I think Israel, like Biden wants to support Israel, and Trump wants to support Israel even more than Biden does. So Israel doesn't really have to worry about losing U.S. support. It's going to be there no matter what. That's not the same for Ukraine. If Trump is elected, if we listen to Viktor Orban, who met with Trump a couple of weeks ago, like he has said that there's not going to be any more funding for Ukraine if Trump gets elected. And I think the anti sort of Ukraine arming contingent is much more vocal and has a lot more strength than any of the sort of anti-Israel stuff does. So if I was Israel, I wouldn't be worried about losing U.S. support in the short term very much, in the same way that Ukraine really does have to worry about that. The flip side of that is that Ukraine has other options. Ukraine is part of Europe. And if Ukraine is going to survive as a sovereign and independent country, it has to survive because Europe supports it, not because the United States is going to support it. And this maybe is in some ways one of the more important things to come out of last weekend, which is, all of these issues that we're talking about, Ukraine, Israel, these are not existential for the United States. It does not existentially affect the security of the United States if Russia, God forbid, takes over all of Ukraine. That's not a problem for the U.S. In an existential, I'm not saying it's not a problem at all. I'm saying like on a national security level, like what changes for the median American voter? Let's say even, Iran and Israel, full scale war or something like that. Okay, like the U.S. doesn't have to import oil from the Middle East anymore because of the shale revolution. The U.S. is an energy superpower in and of its own right. The U.S. does not have those types of existential interests in the Middle East that it did before. U.S. existential interests are tied to the Asia Pacific region and the relationship with China and what's happening in that part of the world. So as we see this shift away in United States foreign policy, however slowly and however haltingly away from Europe and from the Middle East, that's why I'm saying the future of Ukraine depends on Europe. The future of Israel and Iran matters much more. What's the future of Turkey? What is Turkey going to say? What is Saudi Arabia going to do? What is Egypt going to do? What is a country like India, which imports a lot of energy from this part of the world? Whose side are they going to be on? Like those are the countries that actually matter more in the long term, whereas I think the United States is slowly moving its gaze towards Asia Pacific and towards Latin America.
That definitely is a change. That's a shift compared to where we were, say, in the early 90s, for sure. Okay, so to wrap up, what I've heard from you is pay very close attention, looking forward to how Israel responds and what they do next. Are there any other things that we should be watching out for?
In the Middle East or just in general?
Well, specific to Iran, Israel, and what's going on in the Middle East, the Gaza Strip.
Yeah. So the two things that I would watch in addition to everything that we've talked about right now. Number one, Turkey was very quiet for the first few days after Iran bombed Israel. I'd also note the same day that Iran was bombing Israel, Turkey was bombing Kurdish militants in northern Iraq. So like that got completely swept under. They do it a lot, but like Turkey is sort of doing its own thing in that part of the world. Turkey came out yesterday. We're recording on Wednesday. Turkey came out yesterday finally and said, we blame all of the escalation on Israel. Which, if I'm an Israeli strategist, that should send a shiver down my spine, because Iran, for all of the melodrama about this, is a long way away from Israel. Iran can't invade Israel over land. It can't blockade Israel by sea. It can't even attack Israel with fighter jets, because you can't. Fighter jets don't have enough fuel capacity to get from Iran to Israel, bomb things, and then come back. That's why you have to resort to drones and missiles and things like that. That's not true for Turkey. And for me, Turkey is the most powerful, most modern country in the Middle East. And if that country takes stock of the weekend's events and says, hey, Israel, this was your fault, that's why I say, what strategy is Israel pursuing there? Because if you're pissing off your northern neighbor, who is the strongest power in this part of the world and will be for the coming decades, that's not good. So watch out for what Turkey's going to do. And then the other country that has been relatively quiet here is Saudi Arabia, which is a long-term nemesis of Iran. Buried the hatchet a little bit with the help of the Chinese last year, but has been relatively quiet. So are they going to push back? Are they okay with Iran doing this because they want to have tacit support for the Palestinian cause? And as long as Iran doesn't hit oil infrastructure or block the Straits of Hormuz, they'll look the other way. It'll be really interesting, especially as Saudi Arabia pursues some kind of defense agreement with the United States, with normalization of ties with Israel as part of the deal. I haven't really seen kind of how Saudi Arabia is going to react yet. They're just sort of quiet and, okay, great. Like oil wasn't affected. We're just going to put our heads down and keep doing what we're doing. So those are the two countries that I would really keep an eye on, because more than any others, they're going to define probably where this goes from here.
Well, that's another episode of the Frontlines podcast with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments and Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture. Jacob, thanks so much for doing this again.
Always a pleasure. See you soon, Shaun.